Hi, it's Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. Happy New Year. Today, I want to talk about temporary protected status and the things that have been going on in the state of Minnesota recently. So, what is temporary protected status? Temporary protected status, or otherwise known as TPS, you'll probably hear me say that throughout this video, is a humanitarian immigration program created by Congress in the Immigration Act of 1990. So it's a relatively new thing in immigration law. It allows nationals of a designated country to remain in the United States temporarily when the conditions in their home country makes their return to their home country unsafe. Those conditions can include armed conflict, environmental disasters, or other extraordinary and temporary circumstances. TPS protects people from deportation and allows them to work legally in the United States. It's not amnesty. It's not a green card, and it does not excuse criminal conduct. It's narrow, conditional, and temporary by design. So what is TPS for? The logic of TPS is straightforward. It's based on country conditions, not based on race, religion, or domestic political expediency. And we'll get into that in more detail in a minute. Now, that's why TPS is designated nationally, not locally. A civil war, a famine, or a state collapse doesn't suddenly become safe because somebody crosses a state line within the United States. The danger exists in that country of origin, and TPS exists to respond to that reality. Here's where we get into the problem. The Trump administration has attempted to justify targeting Somali TPS holders in Minnesota by pointing to alleged fraud and criminal conduct tied to public benefits programs. So even before you analyze the legality, that justification deserves skepticism. But once you examine the timeline, it collapses entirely. The first thing you got to remember here is that the fraud allegations in Minnesota are old and for the most part have already been resolved. The fraud allegations being cited here were detected by law enforcement in 2021, investigated and prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice in 2022 under the Biden administration. Criminal charges were brought, cases were litigated, convictions and plea agreements followed. In other words, the criminal justice system already did exactly what it is supposed to do. Repackaging these prosecutions years later does not reflect a newly discovered problem. It reflects a search for a pretext. And the timing here really does matter. These long settled cases are being selectively resurrected now at the precise moment the Trump administration is facing renewed and deeply damaging scrutiny over the Epstein files and other very serious self-inflicted scandals. In that context, it's entirely reasonable to conclude that this is not about immigration enforcement at all, but about distraction, redirecting public attention towards a politically vulnerable immigrant community instead of toward the administration's own inexcusable conduct. Okay, now let's be clear about something. TPS is political, but it's not supposed to be partisan. TPS is political in the sense that, like much of immigration law, it reflects foreign policy judgments, humanitarian priorities, and U.S. foreign policy interests abroad. In that sense, TPS has always been part of statecraft. But TPS is not supposed to be partisan. It's not supposed to be used as a domestic political weapon. It's not meant to score political points that support upcoming domestic elections. It was certainly never designed to inflame resentment towards disfavored nationalities inside the United States. When TPS decisions are untethered from country conditions and instead driven by domestic partisan incentives, those programs stop functioning as foreign policy and become political theater. And there are Hatch Act implications here. When executive authority is exercised not to advocate legitimate governmental objectives, but to fuel partisan narratives, distract from scandal, or punish politically vulnerable groups, it raises serious concerns under the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act exists precisely to prevent the use of official government power for partisan political ends. Using immigration authorities as a tool of domestic party politics is arguably inconsistent with that prohibition. There's also international law implications here. Under international law, the United States is bound by the principle of non-refoulement. That principle prohibits a country from returning anyone to another country where that person, that individual, is likely to face persecution, torture, or other serious harm. And that's not just an aspirational concept of customary international law. It's binding. It exists under modern international refugee law, human rights law, and customary international law. Temporary protected status is one of the domestic mechanisms the United States uses to comply with that obligation. To knowingly strip protection and send people back to a country where the underlying danger has not meaningfully changed is not just bad policy, it's a violation of the principle of non-refoulement. Let's also not minimize the fact that stripping TPS from an entire nationality is a form of collective punishment. Even assuming, purely for the sake of argument, that crimes did occur in Minnesota, what has followed is legally indefensible. This is collective punishment, threatening tens of thousands of people with the loss of fundamental human rights protections, not for what they did, but for what others allegedly did. Collective punishment violates some of the most foundational principles of international human rights law. Responsibility is individual. Punishment must be individual. If someone committed fraud, I am totally on board with prosecuting them to the fullest extent of the law. I'm even okay with deporting them if it was a deportable offense. But you don't punish an entire nationality for the sins of a few. Moreover, the alleged fraud here had nothing to do with being Somali. The programs involved here were open to citizens and non-citizens alike. Somali nationality did not enable the conduct. It didn't even advance it. It did not cause it at all. Using nationality as a proxy for criminality is not law enforcement. It's scapegoating, and it's totally inconsistent with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which gets to the concept of selective enforcement. Comparable allegations involving other populations within the United States have not triggered nationality-wide punishments. The population selected here is overwhelmingly Black, overwhelmingly Muslim, and politically marginalized. That reality is not incidental, and it cannot be ignored. Finally, there is no legal authority, nor is there any historical precedent for revoking temporary protected status for an entire nationality within a single U.S. state. TPS is based on country conditions, not internal geography of the United States. If Somali nationals in Minnesota allegedly no longer merit protection, but Somali nationals in other U.S. states do, the policy collapses under its own logic. The whole concept is absurd. All it would take would be for the protected Somalis in Minnesota to move to another state, which they're free to do. That alone tells you this is not serious immigration policy. It's punitive political theater. In summary, revoking TPS from Somalis in Minnesota is unlawful, pretextual, racially targeted, and institutionally corrosive. It violates domestic law, international human rights law, and the United States obligations under the principle of non-refoulement. It should be challenged accordingly, and it almost certainly will be challenged accordingly in a court of law. And I'm looking forward to those debates. Just as a quick addendum here at the end, there are a lot of resources that we used to build this video. We have citations to a lot of sources that we think are important. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to disseminate those in a video form, but if you are interested in this topic, there will be a bibliography and there will be a list of works cited in the episode notes for this video. Please look those up on our Substack account.